I want to say to my incredible colleague, Tina Smith, the incredible stance that she just made, the facts she laid plain, the reality she has exposed, it is so important. The exercise that's gone on this floor for the last 24 hours has been extraordinary and unusual. And one of the reasons why leader after leader came to the Senate floor was to show that this is not usual times. These are not usual times. It is extraordinary to me that all through the night, at the 2 o'clock hour, the 3 a.m. hour, the 4 a.m. hour, the 5 a.m. hour, senator after senator came down here to speak up, to talk about the unusual things that are going on in America, and in truth, the things that we believe unequivocally are violative of not just our democratic norms, but violative of the separation of powers. Now, many of this is taken up in the courts already. You have state attorney generals suing right now because powers that were given to Congress are being taken by the executive. We know in the United States of America that we do not have a king. We are not an authoritarian government. And the debates of our founding fathers were central to this point, that we should have three branches of government, co-equal branches with clearly laid out in Article 1, Article 2, Article 3, clearly laid out rules and responsibilities, obligations under the Constitution. Now, this whole process, one could say we're doing one of our Article 1 obligations, to advise and consent on the president over his nominations to key positions like OMB. But this is so much more than that. This is not just us advising and giving consent. It is standing up for what was the bipartisan norms of our nation. In fact, it was the democratic norms of our nation from the very beginning, that Congress has certain roles. And I often say we're the Article 1 branch of government. The Article 2 branch of government has their roles, but our role, perhaps very importantly, is the power of the purse. Spending decisions, spending priorities, spending allocations are made in this body, and the people have a say in that through our elections. Every 2 years, a third of this body is up. Every 2 years, all of the House of Representatives are up. And the people elect people to carry out the Constitution. We swear an oath. I've done it a number of times now to protect and defend the Constitution. And so why are we doing this unusual thing of talking all through the night about a nominee for something that many Americans don't know much about, the Office for the Management and Budget? That is because what has been going on in the first 3 weeks of the Trump administration is a reckless violation of our separation of powers. This body has differences, but there's one thing I know my colleagues and I agree on, is that the powers assigned to Congress by the Constitution are sacrosanct. And we cannot allow a president to step over their powers and begin to do things that are more akin to dictatorships or authoritarian governments. We have seen that erosion of democracy from Europe to Africa, where executives elected begin to try to take powers away from the other branches of government. Let me give you a specific example. Agencies within the federal government are set up by Congress, funded by Congress, given directives and a mission by Congress, and then Congress provides oversight for those agencies. and how the executive is conducting those congressional mandates. What we saw over the last week or so was a direct assault on a bipartisan congressional intent. USAID, the United States Agency for International Development. The President of the United States decided that he didn't want that agency to exist. Without any thought, without any strategy, without any understanding of the agency's vital functions, the President of the United States took an agency funded in a bipartisan manner where colleagues of mine, I serve on the Foreign Relations Committee, know so much of the work done on both sides of the aisle to support the critical mission of USAID. They attacked it and tried to dismantle and stop it. Suddenly, the workers we have around the globe saw everything freeze. They were told to stop what they were doing. They were denied access to their emails, to critical files. Many of them were put into vulnerable situations because a lot of our great USAID government officials work in unstable environments. And suddenly their cell phones are not working and they can't access their email. Resources that we allocated in a bipartisan way that were being spent for critical missions of the United States were so abruptly frozen that food aid, perishables, were left sitting on docks. Medicines were stopped in their tracks, many of them that are perishable as well. You want to talk about government waste? Food that can keep people alive, medicines that can keep people alive, were left basically to spoil. And this all ripples. Most people don't know this. There are 50,000 private sector jobs here in the United States, people that contract with the government, that are connected to this agency, USAID, created by Congress in a bipartisan fashion, year after year, funded in a bipartisan agreements, bicameral. The President of the United States, by fiat, the President of the United States decides we're going to kill this agency, stop it in its tracks. That is a violation of the separation of powers. Plain and simple. Congress created the agency. If the president wants to get rid of it, he should come to Congress. This presidential action didn't show Donald Trump's strength. It showed his weakness. Because a strong president makes his case to the American people, makes his case to Congress, lays out a vision, lays out a strategy, comes before Congress and proposes the legislation to do what they're saying. But no, not this president. Instead of following our constitutional dictates, instead of doing what a strong leader would have done, instead of doing what FDR did when he did sweeping things in the government, he came to Congress to fight, to pass the laws, to support his agenda. LBJ, Ronald Reagan, strong presidents who have a vision for this country that might be a little revolutionary, that might create great changes, they respect our Constitution. And they come to Congress with their vision to pass the laws necessary to support that vision. I've watched it over my lifetime. I haven't always agreed with what the presidents did. From Bush to Reagan, didn't agree with all their decisions, but they showed strength. They came to Congress and got Congress to pass laws, to execute their bold vision. I think a lot of bad decisions were made that way, but it went through Congress. Congress had a vote on the Iraq War. Congress had a vote on the authorization to use military force. Congress had a vote on welfare reform. Congress voted on Bill Clinton's vision for public safety to put 100,000 police officers on the street. Congress voted for the war on drugs. These are things I might not have always agreed with, but strong presidents come before Congress in alignment with the Constitution, with a respect for the separation of powers, with abiding by the law. Strong presidents stand in the well of the House of Representatives and give a vision for this country. As it says in my faith, without vision, the people will perish. God bless the visionary presidents we've had. John F. Kennedy pointing to the skies and saying, we will go to the moon. And then what did he do? He came to Congress with a vision to increase funding for science, math, for STEM education. What did he do? Came to Congress with a vision for making NASA something that would be the envy of the world. What did he do? He inspired a nation with a vision that was so compelling, Democrats and Republicans joined together and followed it. What does this president do? What does Donald Trump, who's no Reagan, who's no JFK, what does he do? In the dark of night, he sends in unelected individuals to access computer systems in a way that is so violative of the privacy of Americans, and without congressional approval, without a legal basis, they go in and upend agency after agency after agency, and for USAID, they shut it down. That's not a visionary presidency. That is reckless, undercover vandalism, illegal action, and the hurting of Americans. And so why has senator after senator come down here to speak up? Why? Because to treat this as normal would be to normalize these constitutional violations. And to allow someone like Vought, who has been saying over and over again, I don't respect the Constitution, I don't respect the courts, I don't respect the rule of law, we are going to take over. If you don't believe me, listen to what Vought says. His own words. He believes that Congress should do what it wants to do. We knew that Vought published this memo and basically said, I have no regard for the federal law or for Congress's power of the purse. In 2018, Vought was instrumental in the Trump administration's attempt, they weren't successful, attempt to use the Impoundment Control Act to withhold appropriate funds beyond their period of availability. This was a backdoor way to try to go around the law. This idea of impoundment is a theory that a president, despite Congress in a bipartisan, bicameral way, passing a funding bill, this is the idea that the President of the United States, despite all of that, can just say, nah, forget Congress, forget the will of the people, forget the people's representatives, forget the United States Senate. I decide what we spend as a country. And so he tried this attempt. But the attempt was determined by our processes to be illegal. The GAO, the Government Accounting Office, says you can't do that. But Vought kept pushing to employ the same strategy the following year to try to freeze foreign aid This is 2018. The past is prologue, folks. And in doing so, he wanted to do it again, ignoring the 2018 GAO legal decision. In a response to a 2020 pre-hearing question, this is how flagrantly defiant Vought is. In a response to a 2020 pre-hearing question, Vought wrote this: "I will not abide by the 2018 decision, claiming it was wrongly decided." Think about this. He's in the administrative branch and deciding that a legal decision was wrongly decided. So perhaps Vought not only wants to do the job of Congress, but now he wants to do the job of the Article III branch of government, the courts as well. What does that sound like? Does that sound like a patriot to our democratic traditions? No. Does that sound like somebody who's willing to follow the rule of law? No. Does that sound like somebody who is in the spirit of 1776, the spirit of compromise, the spirit of patriotism, the spirit of adherence to the democratic ideals of the United States of America? No. It sounds like someone that believes that they have the power to act in an authoritarian manner and declare themselves the executive, the legislature, and the courts. It is a deliberate misreading. And the GAO, their earlier decision, previously signaled that the consequence of an unenacted rescission proposal should be the full, prudent obligation of budget authority. In other words, I am king. In his response to following his nomination hearing, GAO's legal decision, writing in a response to our Homeland Security Committee, he says, "I do not agree with the GAO's report. OMB did not violate the ICA as I set forth in my January 19, 2020 letter to John Yarmouth, chairman of the House Committee on Budget." In other words, he's still standing strong during his confirmation hearing that he's doing the right thing. He stands by this defiance. He stands by this violation of separation of powers. And here's what a former employee who worked at USDA wrote about how dangerous this position is. For 30 years across both Republican and Democratic administrations, decades of constitutional norms, decades of bipartisan commitment. This is what this employee said. "I argue Russ Vought is the most dangerous person in the Trump administration. Even over Trump, given his ideological bent and belief, he believes that the president does not spend congressional appropriations. This USDA official said, defines a dictator." We can't normalize this. And this is what I know, being here for over a decade now, is if this was being done by the Barack Obama administration, there would be hair on fire on the other side of the aisle. Every Republican would look like me as a bald man. They'd have no more hair. If Barack Obama decided to ignore the dictates of Congress, to say your funding decisions have no hold on my actions, that I am going to ignore congressional mandate, I'm going to ignore congressional rules, my Republican colleagues would be apoplectic. If he decided with foreign policy that, hey, there's this thing called the Hyde Amendment, I'm going to ignore it. If Barack Obama did that, not one of them would normalize it or excuse it or look the other way. It's that complicity that bothers me. We are at a constitutional crossroads here. We do have someone in power now who is showing weakness. It's a weakness that other authoritarians and democratic nations have tried to do. I'm not going to work through the system as designed by that nation's founders. I'm not going to work in adherence to the spirit of the Constitution. I am going to do as much as I possibly can to take power for myself, to violate norms, to violate the Constitution, to indeed violate the law, and then challenge you to stop me. And the question is, who will speak up? Silence is complicity. And there might be some people who are just sitting and saying, oh, this is politics as usual. Oh, this is right-left fighting. Oh, this is not really that important. What does this have to do with me? Well, let me lay it plain, giving you one example of what's happened. Stopping USAID's work without any plan or strategy has now endangered every American. Because there's things we get to go to bed at night and not have to think about because we have a government full of officials, scientists, hardworking people who every day make it their life mission to focus on things so that we, the people, do not have to think about it. Think about that for a second. We know it in our own towns and communities. We have firefighters, we have police officers that stand on the front line. They stand in the breach to protect us, to get dangerous things and conditions and people off the streets so that we're safe and we don't have to think about it every night. Well, that goes for USAID too. They are a national security organization. How do I know that? Yeah, I'm a spiritualist. I really am. I believe there's universal spiritual principles. One of them was spoken by this great American, one of the few people that's not a president of the United States whose statue sits under the dome. He was a spiritualist. He was, in fact, a person of faith. He was a minister. And he spoke to us about a scientific truth using spiritual language. It was in this great body of work called The Letters from the Birmingham Jail. And if he only knew that his words would resound in history, these spiritual words would speak to a scientific truth. He said this, he said, "We are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, that we are tied in a common garment of destiny, that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." Powerful words, right? But what do they have to do with science, Cory? What do they have to do with our present political crisis, our present constitutional crisis? What do they have to do with that? Well, here's what they have to do with that. You see, the wisdom of this body, as I've worked in a bipartisan way on the Foreign Relations Committee, we fund the USAID to do things to protect us, but we're not doing them at home. USAID officials are around the globe. And one of the reasons why we, in the wisdom of Congress, that this president is trying to violate, one of the things that we know, because we've got engineers in this place, we've got doctors in this place. We've got dedicated public servants in this place. We've got a few big, bald nerds like me in this place. What we know is that the USAID does work that is vital to keep Americans who are sleeping at night safe. Let me be specific. Right now in Uganda, there is an Ebola outbreak in the capital. Ebola is a vicious disease that is highly infectious. I remember this because back under the presidency of Barack Obama, it was dominating the headlines. I saw one of the most courageous things done that Chris Coons here flew to Africa to support the efforts that the United States of America through USAID was doing to stop Ebola in its tracks in Africa so it didn't visit us here. But because of the global interconnected transportation systems, it was getting closer and closer to threatening American lives. This was a crisis that dominated the headlines during the Obama administration. And who was then there to fight the spread of Ebola, to arrest it in that African nation? Who was it? USAID, American people. Who is in Uganda right now? Up until the Trump administration stopped their work, who was there? Americans working for USAID. In the midst of a nasty, horrific infection, they were like our first responders. They were like our soldiers because they understand that spiritual truth that King spoke: injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. An infectious disease anywhere is a threat to public health everywhere. What was the administration's plans to deal with global infectious outbreaks? Did they come to Congress and put forth a vision? No. What was the administration's strategy to stop the growing threat of global pandemics and global threats? Did they share that plan with Congress? No. What was this administration going to do? Well, they didn't seem to care. There wasn't one hearing about this. There wasn't one conversation. There wasn't a consultation with Congress where leaders from the Health Committee or leaders from the Foreign Relations Committee were invited to the White House to discuss their strategy in making sure that the vital functions of this agency are preserved. They were pursuing a radical ideological agenda, ignoring the truth of science and the power of the spiritual truth that America's interests and national security demand Americans, be they soldiers or scientists, sometimes standing away from our country in Africa, in Asia, in Europe, protecting us from infectious diseases that are so nightmarish that most Americans would be happy to continue to send taxpayer dollars to stop Ebola in Africa, so that someone doesn't get on a plane not knowing that they're infected and come to visit our country and begin an outbreak of disastrous proportions. But here's something that USAID has been working on that's terrifying to me. Truly is. I've been talking about it for a long time in Congress. That we're beginning to see bugs around this planet that are resistant to antibiotics. Oh, I've talked about this in my work because I think we are these overusers of antibiotics. We use most 50% of our antibiotics are being used prophylactically, that not because they're treating diseases, but because of the way we raise animals in America now. We have to inject them over and over and over again to try to stop them from getting sick and end up with these horrible things that or when farmers have to cull their whole herd of pigs or chickens because of some kind of outbreak. This threat of antibiotic-resistant diseases, well, thousands of Americans die to them all the time. So here is a particularly infectious, nasty disease. It's called tuberculosis. And right now, I shouldn't say that because Trump has stopped it, but there were some of the best scientists in the world that happened to be ours, Americans, working for USAID on the front lines of treatment-resistant tuberculosis. It's not just Ebola in Uganda. USAID workers were trying to figure out what kind of treatments and regimes could be put into place to stop the spread of resistant tuberculosis because of the virulently viral nature of that awful disease. How irresponsible for a president whose number one responsibility is to protect Americans, to tear down the agency, stop the agency workers, cut off their cell phones, cut off their emails, cut off their access to files, leave them not even knowing how they would get home on the front lines of an infectious disease that they're trying to stop so it does not show up in America. This is not just a violation of our Constitution. This is not just a violation of separation of powers. This is not just a violation of the law. This is a violation of common sense. This is a violation of pragmatism. This is a violation of a sacred oath to protect the American people. And I heard it, folks. You did as well. The promises that were being made to America in the campaign of this president. I will keep you safe. I will drive down your costs. Well, in 3 weeks in office, we are less safe to infectious diseases than we were under the past two presidents. Biden, Trump won, didn't tear down USAID's infectious disease work. Obama. Republicans and Democrats. I've worked with many of my colleagues across the aisle on making sure that we are funding the important global work to fight infectious diseases. Heck, I've passed bipartisan legislation to stop wet markets, which is one of the places that these zoonotic diseases can leap to human beings. I saw momentum after COVID that we should be working together to stop infectious disease that might start in China, in Africa, in Europe from coming to America. There seemed to be a bipartisan commitment to that idea in Congress, and it's one of the reasons why, in the past presidents, we have funded USAID to do this vital work with some of the best scientists on the globe, who are willing to put their lives at risk to step into an Ebola outbreak, a tuberculosis outbreak, an avian flu outbreak, and say, I will do what I can to protect my country, like firefighters do and soldiers do, police officers do. They're great Americans, but what happened to them? What happened to these great Americans risking their life to stop infectious diseases? The President of the United States, in an act of cowardice, did not come to Congress to put a vision for how we would protect our nation from infectious diseases, how we would do the vital work of USAID. No! In the cover of night, countermanding our laws, violating the Constitution, and an affront to the wisdom on both sides of the aisle, he just went ahead and did it. He just went ahead and did it. The world is a complex and dangerous place. And as much as government workers are being maligned and attacked and vilified and beat up upon, most Americans take for granted what these patriotic Americans do every day. You shop at your supermarket and don't think about, does this food have some disease or worm in it? Because these government workers at USAID are inspecting that food and are making it safe. A lot of government workers got flashed on the TV. With our first major aviation accident, 16 years. Well, I get on planes a lot. And I've gone and talked to air traffic controllers. I've fought for them and their contracts because I know that during those 16 years that no accident happened, you had incredible government workers working very hard, pouring their heart out in one of the most stressful jobs to keep us safe so that when I jump on the plane, I don't think about the air traffic around me. I know that I'm on an aviation system that's safer than me getting in my car because of government workers. We, in a bipartisan way, and this is what I'm saying, there's so much goodness on both sides of the aisle. We have government workers that are doing suicide prevention work for our veterans. When we were seeing veteran after veteran die day after day after day, there are government workers, some of them I've met, that make it their mission to be there for veterans that come home with invisible wounds. Now, I'm going to make a statement that may sound braggadocious or hyperbolic, but it's actually true. In this body, there are former governors, there are former county executives, and there are former mayors. None of them, when they were an executive, cut government more than I did. I cut the size of Newark, New Jersey's government by 25%. Think about that. Cutting a governmental body by a quarter. I did it. It was painful. It was hard. It was difficult. It was during the Great Recession, and I had no choice. But I had a city council. There were rules in the way I did it. There were civil service protections, which I abided by. Oh, but not this president. We actually used what people call buyouts. We offered packages to people. But all of this we did in accordance to the laws of our state and my city, in conjunction with our legislative body. We presented a vision for Newark, put a plan forward that, hey, these departments may be losing personnel, but we're going to make them more efficient. To this day, I remember some of the data. We had like half the inspectors, but did almost twice as many inspections because we had a thoughtful plan that we executed in consultation and coordination with our legislative branch. I'm the first person to tell you, as the #1 government cutter in this place, that there are a lot of ways to cut waste. Just the procurement process alone in the Department of Defense still being done ways that are antiquated, that are being corrupted by people that leave the Pentagon, go work for the big contracting agents, this circle that is corrupting. There's ways to create more transparency on that. There's ways to bring new technology on that. There's so many ways to improve that system. How do I know this? Because the first person to tell me this out at his ranch in Arizona with the former Secretary of Navy in a late night conversation where I just sat there and learned at the foot of some wise men was John McCain. He went on and on and on about the corruption in our United States military that is undermining our fighting forces. He said we could be spending less and have higher capabilities if we only started to root out the wasteful spending and the corruption in that institution. We should be doing this in a bipartisan way. There are so many things that many of us see that don't make sense. And there is a process we could follow to do it. A president that is a strong president would come to Washington, would come to Congress, would give a bold address like Kennedy did when he said we were going to go to the moon, like LBJ did when he said we're going to be a great society, like Ronald Reagan did when he said it was going to be morning in America again. This is my vision, this is my plan, I'm bringing it to Congress, and we're going to get it done. But no, this president didn't come here to push our government to a higher level, to inspire and engage, be thoughtful about how we were going to be safer, stronger, and more prosperous. No. He brought in an unelected billionaire that everybody in this body knows is so conflicted, a guy who has so many government contracts, a guy whose net worth has been deeply affected by this government. He brought him in, and him and his agents have gone into systems that to me violate privacy, that have no transparency of what they're doing until we wake up in the middle of the night or wake up the next day and found out that the people on the front lines fighting against infectious diseases that threaten the United States, they're gone, cut off. We just saw this last week when Donald Trump froze funding to everything, from veterans to first responders, froze funding for daycare that had everybody in this nation. I had calls from mayors who were Republicans, Democrats, independents that couldn't access certain key portals, that had acted in contracting, relying upon a government stream of money, that had made plans and hiring decisions that suddenly were cut off in a lurch. Now, the powerful thing about that is the outrage across America took this president who was violating the law, violating bipartisan spending decisions, violating the separation of powers. The fact that Americans from all over this country spoke up and spoke out, it stopped him in his tracks. Because that is how you deal with injustice. You don't normalize it, you call it out. And God bless America. This man who thought he was going to bully and steamroll and cut critical streams of funding all across this country was stopped in his tracks. Now he said, I'm just pulling back temporarily because I'm going to come back at this. But the sigh of relief, I've met with prosecutors this week. I've met with police officers this week. I've met with people that voted for him, voted against him, and didn't vote in my state. And all of them said that was an outrageous move. Thank God we stopped him. Well, how did we stop him? By speaking up. By not normalizing this, not thinking this is just politics as usual. And so that's what this all-night Speak Out has been about. It's about raising voices. It's about not being silent. It's about the gifts of this democracy. The right to protest. The right to petition your government. The freedom of speech. You see, we believe in this democracy that the power of the people is greater than the people in power. We believe in this democracy that every voice matters. Donald Trump is creating chaos, confusion. People like Vote have said on the record they don't care about constitutional norms. They don't care about legal proceedings and the outcomes because that's wrongly decided. I've decided that that's not binding on me. That don't believe, like Vote doesn't believe, that we make spending decisions that the President of the United States, despite the budget that was negotiated and passed by two chambers in a bipartisan way, that the President can then decide, I don't like this. Congress decided a spending priority, I don't care, I'm not spending that money. That's vote. And so some people say, well, they have the votes. Cory, can't you count? Well, I know I am here because I stand on the shoulders of my ancestors, like all of us do. We are all the beneficiaries of the struggles and the sacrifices that came before us. We're all the beneficiaries of moments in American history where democracy was in the balance and the majority of our people chose the right way. We are all here because in the Depression, when a general of the United States was calling for a military takeover, people stood up and spoke out. We're all here because during World War II, before America joined and there was a Nazi rally at Madison Square Garden pulled to the rafters, that more Americans here said that we are going to resist fascist impulses. We're all here because on the left, there was a senator named Huey Long that said, oh, the people should take over the Capitol. They're going to storm the Capitol. I'm going to be with the people. Well, the people weren't listening to that extremist at the time. We're all here because moment after moment in American history where democracy was at a crossroads, where our Constitution was at a crossroads, people of good faith stood up. I remember one of the earliest women senators who stood up against McCarthyism. Right here on the floor, criticizing somebody of her own party. She spoke up, profiling courage. I was taught a lot about that courage. In a chapter many people may not remember, there's a little panel to it right there. If you are in the gallery and you walk out, there's a panel to this wonderful moment in American history when we were at a crossroads. It was the election of 1876 between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden. It was hotly contested. You see, in that, one person, Tilden, won the popular vote. But Hayes seemed to have won the Electoral College. Now, the Democrat Tilden, there was a lot of controversy because this was post-Reconstruction, post the Civil War, and the South had lots of African Americans participating. And this left a bit of a constitutional crisis. And what became the Compromise of 1877, Hayes was declared the winner, but the compromise that was made is that the Republican Hayes would win and be the president, as he was, in exchange for what the Democrats wanted, which was to pull federal troops out of the South that were protecting African Americans. An outcome of an election not just upended Reconstruction, upended the progress that was being made, upended something that was incredible, which was, I'm the fourth black person ever elected to the United States Senate, but during the Reconstruction era, the first one appointed, there were two. Black folks, from the end of the Civil War until about 1901, when the last African-American, Congressman White, left this place because of the fall of Reconstruction. Because as soon as federal troops were pulled out, reigns of terror began in the South. All kind of laws were being passed to stop blacks from voting, because in America, voting is power. Black elected officials were being beaten. Black judges were being pulled out into streets, whipped. The Klan rose. Lynching in America Hundreds and hundreds of African Americans were being lynched with regularity who were standing up for their power. There were massacres going on to cut down black political power. Here we had an election, and the results in terms of our constitutional norms, the power to vote, the idea that we secure the rule of law, protect citizens, all of that was being upended in flames and terror and violence and lynching in the South that took an early wave of black participation in Congress. And the last one, Congressman White, 1901, gave a Phoenix speech. He knew it would be the last time, and he predicted that blacks would disappear from Congress, but one day they would rise like a phoenix. Now, interesting, in his state, a black person didn't come from North Carolina's congressional delegation. That was 1901, not until 1992 was another African American elected from North Carolina. His prediction was right. Blacks would disappear because of the terror in the South, but because of the power of the civil rights movement, blacks and whites and Asians and Latinos, it was a rainbow coalition of people who would not be silent amongst tyranny, amongst violence and oppression. American citizens from all backgrounds, all religions, all races, bounded together and were not silent. Spoke up. One of my great heroes in this time, who I am seeing her spirit today, I am seeing her spirit yesterday at a rally, I am seeing her spirit across this country of people who know they can't necessarily stop right now what's going on, but are saying, I'm going to speak up anyway. This person was named Ida B. Wells. Now, Ida B. Wells was a journalist in the South, and she was documenting the lynching of African Americans, documenting the injustices being done, documenting how the abuses of political power and electoral power were being used in a fascist way to stop the people from being heard. And the lynchings, the gruesome lynchings which she was documenting and putting out there, her pamphlets were becoming nationally known, so upset people that her offices were attacked, ramsackled. She had to flee for her life because Ida B. Wells was not being silent. She was telling the truth. She was letting folks know what was happening. I think about her courage, like to know that what you are doing and what you are saying against an authoritarian style leadership can endanger your life, and yet you still tell the truth. How you're getting threats that you too will be lynched if you don't stop, but you keep telling the truth. The ugly truth. You put the stories out there again and again and again. Ida B. Wells could not be stopped. There were all these common lies that were being said about the lynchings. Oh, these were African Americans who did horrible things. These were African Americans that were guilty of crimes. These were African Americans that were raped. They should have been lynched. They should have been killed. But Ida B. Wells would write detailed stories about the injustices that were even being upheld in courts of law. But she told the truth that so shocked the consciousness of our country that she in many ways may have been a journalist, but she was a farmer. Every day, relentlessly sowing seeds of truth that would one day reap a harvest of consciousness in our country, where good folks, black folk and white folks, people from all backgrounds would finally say enough is enough. Congress here tried to pass anti-lynching bills way back around the time that Ida B. Wells was trying to show that this horrific crime, and this body failed over 100 times over the course of a century, failed to make lynching a violation of the federal law. I'm really proud that I got to lead the legislation in a bipartisan manner to finally correct this injustice, to finally bring full circle some of the work that Ida B. Wells, this truth teller, was doing. I bring up Ida B. Wells today because it's my concluding message. This defiant refusal in the face of injustice, this strength of character in the face of powerful people, governors of states, President of the United States, and others making decisions on the federal level that reaped utter havoc for millions of Americans when you didn't have the numbers, you didn't have the votes, but what you had was the truth. To not let things happen, not just to be a bystander, but to be an upstander. This was what Ida B. Wells did. We study American history with an obligation to let it be not just our past, but we study American history to let it be our calling in the present. So that we can try, as humble as we are, to live up to those who came before us, that but for them, our entire way of being would have collapsed. Ida B. Wells said this: "The way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them." Let me repeat. Ida B. Wells, this documenter of savage injustices, this truth teller about lynchings in America, this sower of seeds of truth that generations later, even in this body, we honored her by passing anti-lynching legislation after a century of trying. Ida B. Wells said the first thing we must do to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them. For all those people in America right now, whether you're a worker in Uganda who can't even access your emails, but you're an American that wants to stop Ebola, whether you're a worker here in the United States that has spent your entire professional life working to protect Americans from threats to our food or our air quality. Whether you're someone who's just seeing what's going on in America right now and you're afraid. Whether you're someone who is worried that vote will come in and upend educational funding that your disabled child relies upon every day. Whether you're an American who is struggling right now and had hoped for promises that my cost of living would get better, but are now seeing that indeed, whether it is a tax on streams of revenue for middle-class families or the police in my community, or whether it's threats of tariffs with our neighbors that directly affecting your small business that's barely staying afloat. Whatever the challenge is, whatever the fear is, what I want to tell you right now is don't normalize a president who is violating the separation of powers. Don't normalize a president who is violating civil service laws. Don't normalize a president who is ignoring the dictates of Congress and establishing agencies. This is the time to summon the spirit of Ida B. Wells and to turn the light of truth upon what is going on, because you may be witnessing defeats, but the democracy is not defeated. You may say what's going on is wrong, but that does not stop the power of right. As the great poet said, you may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may trod me in the very dirt, but still like dust I rise. This mighty nation stands on the shoulders of truth tellers, of defiant, dedicated patriots of grit and gumption. It's we the people. No matter if you're a billionaire or a president, if you're a teacher, if you're a cop, if you're a plumber, this nation says that our voices matter. And in the words of that Negro spiritual, as we have tried to do here all through the night, I hope everyone in America understands that this is the time for us to lift every voice. Mr. President, I yield the floor.